We'll be in Genesis 18, starting in verse 16. We're going to go all the way through the end of chapter 19. So looking at a long passage today, Genesis 18, 16 through 1938. There was a very drunk man who stumbled into a Catholic church, and he went into the confessional booth. And he doesn't say anything for a couple minutes, and so the priest over on the other side clears his throat. He's like, still, the man doesn't say anything, and the priest waits about 30 more seconds. He's getting a little perturbed. I mean, he's there to take confessions, and this man's not saying anything, so he just kind of raps on the side like that. And he says, and finally the drunk man says, "Sorry, brother, I can't help you out. There ain't no toilet paper on this side either." Oh, that's bad. Last week we saw Abraham and Sarah told by God that Isaac would be born. If you remember, they laughed. Both of them laughed. Abraham laughed, and then Sarah laughed. And God decided, because He has a great sense of humor, decided to name Isaac, which means he laughs. And so God says, you laughed, you're going to name your kid Laughs. And I think that was just a wonderful thing by God. And so we have here God who shows up as the person of three men come in, and it is the Lord. It says the Lord came, and there were three men there. And here we have God meeting with Abraham, and God decides that He is about to bring judgment down on a group of cities that are wicked, and He tells Abraham about it first. So as we work our way through Genesis, we're seeing we started with creation. We went into the fall of man. We've got Noah, and we've got Abraham now coming through here. And we're seeing this, the way that God's plan has worked out. God is getting ready to bring down judgment on a group of cities that had sinned continually against Him. Here's what we're going to see. Abraham's intercession, Sodom's sinfulness, Sodom's destruction, Lot's daughter's wickedness. We're not going to read this whole passage, but we're going to read parts of it as we go through. So I want you to see first Abraham's intercession. God decides that He's going to tell Abraham his plan. He looks out and says, what am I going to do? Should I tell Abraham or should I not tell Abraham? But then the Lord goes up to Abraham and He says this, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know. And so God looks and He says, I'm going to go down. I'm going to see what's going on. I'm going to see if Sodom and Gomorrah are really as bad as everybody's telling me. All the intelligence that I have tells me that things are going really bad down there. And I'm going to go down and I'm going to check it out. And as God and Abraham are speaking, Abraham, maybe knowing that Lot lives down there, or also just because of his care for people and his love for people, he starts to talk to God. And he makes intercession for them. And he says, now far be it from me to ever question you, God, but I know you're going to go down there, and I know that you're going to find that something wrong is going on down there, and you're going to execute judgment on these cities. But let me just say, Lord, if there were 50 people there that were righteous, would you spare the city? Would you spare that group of cities, Sodom and Gomorrah and the little towns that were around them? Would you spare them if there were 50 righteous people there? And God says, you know what? For 50 I would spare. I would spare it if there are 50 righteous there. And Abraham says, now I don't want to ask too much, God. But what if there were 5 less than 50? What if there were 45? And God said, I won't destroy it if there's 45 that are righteous there. And Abraham said, I don't really want to push it, but what if there was 40? God says, I won't destroy it if there's 40 righteous down there. Abraham says, how about 30? God says, I won't destroy it if there's 30. Abraham says, Lord, what about 20? If there are 20 righteous people down there, will you spare that land? God says, I will spare it for 20. And Abraham said, I'm only going to ask you one more time, God, if there are 10. And the Lord says, I will not destroy it if I find 10 righteous down there. He says, and I quote, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. So the angels then go down to Sodom, and Lot meets them. As they come into the gate, Lot sees them there, and he says, guys, you got to come in. Let me wash your feet. Let me get everything ready. Let me get you something to eat. Let me get you something to drink. And you come stay in my house tonight because you don't want to stay out here in the square. And the angels say, no, we'll stay out in the square. And Lot says, you don't understand. You cannot stay outside in this city. You have to come in under my protection and come into my house. They refuse, but he insists, and then they decide, okay, we're going to go into the house with Lot. So they're in Lot's house, and listen what happens in verses 4 through 11 of chapter 19. We'll read that here. It says, but before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house. So you notice there was all the men. Every man in the city, except for Lot, surrounds the house. And they called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them. Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. But they said, stand back. And they said, this fellow came to sojourn, but he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. Then they pressed hard against the man Lot, and drew near to break the door down. But the men reached their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they, the angels, struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out, groping for the door. Let me give you just a few thoughts on that passage that we just read. The first thing is that it was all the men of the city. All the men of the city came. You remember what God had said? He said, if I can find 10 that are righteous, I won't destroy the city. How many came to commit this horrible sin? All of them. All of the men of the city showed up. Then I'll also say, Lot, come on, brother. Come on, Lot. First, you made a bad decision in going to live there in the first place. And then what does he do? He offers his daughters to the mob. I don't know what he was thinking. But he offers his daughters up to the mob. Well, when it comes in and it says that they wanted to know them, all right, it didn't mean that they wanted to know him like, hey, how you doing? I want to get to know you. That's not what it's talking about. It's the same way as when Adam knew Eve and they had a child. All right, it's talking about sexual activity here. They said, bring those angels out here so that we can rape them. I think the city was starting to weigh on Lot. It was starting to change who he was, where he wasn't trusting in God. Instead, he was trying to come up with his own way. And the own way that he came up with is that if these men are trying to rape the angels that are in my house, I'm going to give my daughters to them to get raped instead. Not a very good thing. Not a very good thing. When you hang out in a place like Sodom for too long, it really starts to weigh down on you. And it weighed down on Lot. And it made him not think clearly. I want you to see, third, that you can't defeat God's angels. When they tried to break down the door, what did the angels do? They struck them with blindness. Right then. They were blind. And then fourth, even those stricken with blindness will try to sin even when it's futile. What did they do? Even when they were blind and they couldn't see, what did they do? They still groped trying to find the door, trying to find those angels so that they could take them out and commit that sin. Well, what was the sin? Well, it's obviously trying to rape angels, right? That was obviously what they were trying to do. Well, we get the biggest clue from Jude, verse 7. In the New Testament, the little book of Jude, he says in verse 7, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve it as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Jude affirms the sexual nature of the sin in Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom was a place that was evil. It was filled with anger, wrath, inhospitality, vengeance, and hatred. But most of all, it was a place filled with sexual immorality. Jude said they were in a like manner to the fallen angels that he mentions in verse 6, talking about the fallen angels that sexually seduced women outside of God's plan. Likewise, those in Sodom went after that which was outside God's sexual plan. They gave themselves over, he says, to sexual immorality. The word there is ekporneo, which comes from the root word porneo, which means fornication or sexual activity outside of God's plan for sex, which is marriage between a man and a woman for life, and that would be the only relationship in which sexual activity would take place. But that word ekporneo is only used here in Jude. It's an intensified word, that it's not just fornication, but it's fornication that's outside of what even people would normally think would be okay, what the world might think was okay. It's an intensive word that's there. It wasn't your ordinary sexual activity, but gross sexual promiscuity, not just homosexuality, but homosexuality was certainly involved in Sodom. Jude says they went after strange flesh. There were men that went after men for sexual purposes and women that did likewise. It was so bad in Sodom that they tried to rape angels. That's how bad it got. People came in, they tried to rape them. Now there are those that would say that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't homosexual activity, but I think that's an argument that's without merit. Some would say that the sin was rape, which is really not supported by the text. First, the rape never happened, and second, God said, I'm going down to judge the city before the alleged or the attempted rape occurred. Some would say that the sin was inhospitability, that they were showing inhospitality by not welcoming the angels with open arms. And I think it's quite fanciful to say that God destroyed a group of cities with fire and brimstone because they violated cultural notions of hospitality. Jude makes it pretty clear that homosexuality was the main sin of the people in Sodom. The angels then tell Lot, go and tell your sons-in-law, go tell them that it's time to leave. They were engaged to Lot's daughters. They weren't married yet, but they were engaged to Lot's daughters. And they said, go tell them they have got to get out of here because something big is going to go down and it's going to be really bad for these cities. And so Lot comes and says, these places are about to be destroyed. You got to come. And what do the son-in-laws do? They think he's joking. Like, that's funny. There's going to be fire come down from heaven and brimstone and sulfur and whatever. It doesn't matter that he tells them to leave because the place is about to be blown up. They will not go. You see, God demands sexual purity. He demands sexual purity, not just that sex acts be heterosexual rather than homosexual, but that we abstain from adultery, and from fornication, and from lust, and from the like. God demands that we be sexually pure. It's something that's important. So important. It's spoken of multiple times over and over and over in Scripture, how important it is that we as believers remain sexually pure. You know, I see Scripture taken out of context all the time. And here's one that's kind of important. You ever heard your body is a temple? Your body is God's temple, right? Okay. So what always people do that? Well, you should lose weight because your body is God's temple. Well, look, I need to lose weight, but that passage doesn't have anything to do with it. All right? You shouldn't smoke because your body is the temple of God. Well, they used incense in the temple, and it was smoke coming out of it. I mean, that's not what that passage is about. You know, there's always something people say, do you know what that passage is about? It says your body is a temple of God, and would you have a prostitute joined together with the temple of God? That's what that passage is about, right? It's about sexual activity. It says that's something that's important, because if our bodies are the temple, when we engage in sexual activity with somebody else, it joins us together with them. And should we bond together like that outside of the will of God? And the answer is no. God demands that purity. Sin always ends in destruction. Always. And those who ignore God's warning end up destroyed. I want you to see Sodom's destruction and Lot's wife. As we continue on through this story, the angels look at him the next morning and they say, guys, we got to go. And I just imagine Lot's like trying to pack up his suitcase real quick, trying to get everything, and the angel's like, we have got to go right now. It's how I feel sometimes when we're trying to get to church. Come on, kids, right now. Why are your shoes not on? Come on, get going. And that's the way, right? The angels are like, we've got to go. Get out the door. We got to go. We got to go. And they get them out the door. And as they're going, they're saying, now, don't look back. Don't look back. And Lot says, I have just one little request before we go. Will you spare one city? It's just a little tiny one. It's named Zoar. And if you could spare that would give me a nice place to live. Could you do it? And the angels say, fine. You could go to Zoar. You can live there. Say, but we got to get there quick. And by the way, don't look back. Don't stop. Don't look back. Don't look back. What does Lot's wife do when the fire and brimstone comes down? She looks back. And what is she now? A pillar of salt. She looked back. Sometimes we do that as Christians. We'll look back to our old lives. We'll look back with it longingly. We'll look back on it like, man, those were the good old days. Were they really that good? Were the days before you knew Christ really that good? Were the days before you were right with God really that good? People always talk about how much fun, boy, if I could go back to high school. You don't remember sitting in history class and taking notes till your hand fell off for an hour and a half, right? You remember hanging out with your friends. That's what you remember, right? We always tend to remember, and it's like, this is the way it always is. This is just human nature. When things go bad, we remember them later as worse than they were. And when things go good, we remember them as better than they really were. And she looked back and she but it's Sodom, my home. She turned to a pillar of salt. We can't look back longingly on sin. And God's promised judgment happened. God said, get out because I'm about to rain down the fire. And it happened. Sulfur and fire. Smelled like rotten eggs that were on fire and burning. And God destroyed those cities, never to come up again. So what happens after that? Well, Lot, obviously not in a good place. If you just had the city you lived in totally destroyed, you could see your wife and she's a pillar of salt, what are you going to do? You're going to probably be a little depressed. You're going to probably mope a little bit. And then you just hope that you don't have daughters like Lot's daughters. And I'm going to tell you this, them staying in Sodom, as long as they had destroyed any notion of morality there was. I mean, look, every person in their family didn't take God seriously. Every person in their family, as they stayed in Sodom longer and longer and longer, they just died. Lot, Here, rape my daughters instead. The wife, the angel says, don't look back. What does she do? She looks back. And now we have Lot's daughters who go to each other and they say, well, the people we are engaged to, they're dead. Because they were in Sodom, they're dead now. And we are not going to have anybody to carry on our father's name and our father's line. So I've got a good idea. Let's get him drunk. I'll sleep with him tonight. You sleep with him the next night. And we'll have babies with our daddy being the daddy of our babies. Is Lot's family messed up? Yeah. Lot's family is seriously messed up. They do that, have two children. One becomes the father of the Moabites, the other the father of the Ammonites, and both would war with Israel through just about all of Israel's history that we see in the Old Testament. He said he was so drunk, he didn't know what he was doing. Drunk men usually don't know what they're doing. Especially when you get that drunk. Be careful. Don't get drunk. Stay away from it. Because drunk men don't know what they're doing. Do you think Lot would have done that? That Lot would have allowed that to happen if his mind had been in the right place? I can't imagine that he would. Even as long as he had been in Sodom, there was at least enough good in him that God decided to save him from the city. And there was at least enough good in him that he wanted to protect the angels and that he wanted them to come in. So there was at least some semblance of good in him. And I can't imagine that if he hadn't been so drunk that he was passed out, that he would have allowed his daughters to do what they did. And it goes without saying, incest is wrong. And I imagine there was probably a lot of incest going on in Sodom. It's just my guess when you think about that word that Jude used, ekporneo, is about it. I mean, it's just, I think there was probably a lot of incest going on, and they just thought it was, oh yeah, well, we'll just have a baby with daddy. That's what we'll do. Incest is wrong, goes without saying. And it has generational problems, which we see with the Moabites, the Ammonites, and Israel. Well, what do we take from this then? I think we need to pray for our land. Pray for our land. We seem now to celebrate what God has said is wrong in so many ways. We need to pray for our land. And we need to pray for each other that we'll remain sexually pure. Because God meant business with Sodom and Gomorrah, and He would mean the same for us. That we should remain pure in Him. That marriage between a man and a woman is the only place, that man and a woman for life, that's the only place where sexual activity should happen. We should put away lust from our minds. Adultery and fornication, homosexual acts, all the rest of those fall in to the sinful acts that God has condemned. So we need to pray that we would be pure. And it's hard in this day and age, isn't it? It's hard. You ever heard anybody that works in marketing? What do they say? Sex sells. Because it does, doesn't it? Right? I don't see people that look like me in commercials. Right? I see guys that look like Brad Pitt and Fabio in commercials. I see models in commercials. I see models up on the billboards when we drive around. Why? Because sex sells. Because these human beings, biologically, in our fallen state, that's what we're driven towards. We're driven towards that. But when God saves us, He will fix those things. He will fix those things if you ask them, where He could say, yes, I will fix it where your desire. You'll be tempted, but where your desire is for your husband or for your wife. And that is what we need to pray for as a church. What brings down ministries? What brings it down? Most of the time, what has probably brought more disrepute on the name of Christ in the United States of America than sexual sin? We need to pray and ask God to keep us pure. Let's bow our heads together.